My name is Meghan Felt, and I'm an immigration lawyer, obviously with McInnes Cooper. I lead up our immigration practice group, and of course I'm based at the St. John's, Newfoundland office. But we're a relatively large immigration practice group and have grown quite a bit in recent years, with about 13 of us spread across the Atlantic region between partners, associates, staff, and as well as a few paralegals as well. So it's my pleasure to be here today and to speak with you about temp hiring for foreign workers and whether that may be a suitable option for you and your organization. As an immigration lawyer, we deal, and working with McInnes Cooper, of course, as a business corporate law firm, we deal predominantly with employers, but we do represent individuals with all across the immigration spectrum. And what I mean by that is we represent individuals as well as corporations. And we even do a little bit of refugee work and humanitarian compassionate work as well, which makes it for a really interesting, diverse practice area. Today, we're going to be talking about with a little bit more of a lens towards employers and whether hiring of foreign workers for you. But our knowledge base spreads across all the different applications that are available within the immigration landscape. Just a couple of small housekeeping items. Your mics will be muted today, but the idea of this session is to have a little bit of a question and answer type of format. My presentation is actually only 10 slides. I'll elaborate a little bit on things, but I don't anticipate it certainly taking a full hour. It's only going to be probably closer to 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how much I veer off topic. But keep your questions for the end. There will be a chat box where you can submit your questions, and then we'll read them and I'll answer as many of them as I possibly can. Just some instructions on the text box. So apparently you will find this feature on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of you as possible, of course. But of course, feel free to reach out to us in our immigration practice group team if we don't get your question, or if you have maybe something more specific. We'll also talk a little bit about legal labs towards the end of our call or this session as well, which is an option that some of you may be interested in pursuing. So without further ado, we'll get started. The topic today is 10 key questions to help decide if hiring a foreign worker works for you and your organization. I'm not going to get into very specifics and criteria for different programs. We frequently conduct presentations on these things, and we're happy to answer questions on those. But this is more kind of a general presentation on whether you think hiring a foreign worker will be good for you, and just to give you some basic information and lay of the land, and some things to think about in terms of whether this might be an option for you if you haven't done it before, or if you maybe have a little bit of experience but are interested in maybe learning a little bit more. So we're kind of facing a perfect storm right now with regard to Canada's labor shortages and skill shortages. And what I mean by that is that we're in a situation where a combination of factors have led us to get here, and one of them, is certainly the pandemic. The pandemic has completely exacerbated the situation in terms of actually getting people here, and getting us, with regard to getting people here from an immigration perspective. But we also have other things at play as well, which include obviously an aging population, the Great Resignation, so people leaving their jobs, people retiring early, and also increases in technology and automation, and how our labor market hasn't quite caught up with that yet. And so skills gaps are being created because of that. So I'm just going to give you some statistics that I thought were really interesting to kind of just give you a lay of the land as to why we're here in this situation. So the first one is with regard to the aging population. So between 2011 and 2021, Statistics Canada shows that the share of Canadians aged 65 and older grew from 14.4% to 18.5% and is increasing. In terms of retirements, in more than 300,000 people in Canada had already retired or retired in 2022, according to Stats Canada. And that's up from 233,000 the year before. And then what's more, is that the number of people nearing retirement age is higher than ever before as well, with more than 1 in 5 Canadians of working age between 55 and 64 years old. With the average of retirement sitting at around 64, this means that many more Canadians are set to leave their jobs in the coming years. So this is something, some food for thought as to where we're here and how this is likely a situation that's not going away, and that we, one of the obviously main factors ways of solutions, I should say, is through immigration. The other piece I wanted to mention is increase automation and software. So, and technology. So you'll see this now with software developers and software engineers and IT professionals. I mean, we're starving for these types of jobs right now in Canada, and it's been that way for a couple of years. And this is a perfect example of how increases in automation and technology have created skills gaps, and so that we haven't really quite caught up yet. So again, bringing people in from outside the country who have these skills is obviously one way of, and obviously it is only one way, but it's certainly one of the ways of maybe alleviating the skill gap. And then the other piece is the Great Resignation. So a couple of statistics here that I'll read out for you as well that I thought were interesting. So 36% of blue collar workers and 21% of white collar workers in Canada have changed jobs within the prior 12 or the preceding 12 months. And then the other piece is, and this is a study from Stats Canada, of course, 16% of both blue and white collar workers in Canada still anticipate changing jobs in the upcoming 12 months. So, that's something to be aware of as well, is that we have these people leaving jobs, and so that's creating skills gaps and labor shortages as well. So just some information. I mean, I'll get into kind of, that's just kind of a bit of an introduction on why we are where we are right now. I'm going to speak next to, hiring foreign workers and how that might, help maybe your organization alleviate some of the stresses you're seeing with regard to your labor shortages and skills shortages. But I will tell you that, because of this skills challenge that's Canada and the rest of the world is facing right now, particularly here in Canada, for us at least, is what's happening is that more and more employers are looking to immigration to help satisfy and fill those labor gaps, as well as other things. But immigration is certainly a big component, and we've seen it in our practice area. There's about 13 of us. 2 years ago there was maybe 8 of us. We're getting more and more interest from lawyers that are interested in learning about the practice area because there is so much demand. And it's a really interesting and rewarding practice area and fulfilling practice area to be in. It's my passion. But it's certainly a busy one too, and we've seen the uptick as well. So without further ado, let's get started on strategy. So you guys can change the next slide. You can change to the next slide. I'm not sure if Lindsay is there. I don't have control over the slides. Okay, so things to think about, when you're going to hire a foreign worker or not, and what might be the possible solution for you. So we're going to focus on the whys of hiring a foreign worker. So why you might want to hire a foreign worker instead of necessarily how to hire a foreign worker. We've done many presentations on how to hire a foreign worker under various different programs and streams and that kind of thing. But today we're going to focus maybe on why as a little bit of a different lens, and that's kind of the focus of our presentation today. Next slide, please. Timing is everything. So, when I first meet with clients, when I get my first email or a first conversation, one of the first things I'm asked almost 100% of the time is, how long is it going to take me to get this person here? Like, we need them now, or maybe they say, they're not needed now, they're needed in 3 months because they need to give notice at their job. But timing is going to always be a factor because many things will influence that. And I'm not going to get into all the different ins and outs, except that there are ways to bring people in quickly. So it ranges basically from, depending on the circumstances, of course, from anywhere from next day, so to 6-8+ months to get someone work authorization for Canada. There are also backlogs of programs right now with the pandemic. We are seeing a little bit of an ease back on that. So applications are really getting processed faster, and immigration are trying to get rid of backlogs. But there were certainly quite a few backlogs over the course of the pandemic that are just now starting to see, being alleviated. But with regard to timing, it could be, on the short end, we could get someone here feasibly next day, and this would be the situation where it's maybe an individual who has a visa exempt passport. That means they don't need a visa to come to Canada. So U.S. citizen, for example, or a European citizen in most instances, who are maybe coming over to Canada on a short-term basis, maybe as an intercompany transfer, or possibly there's a sale of a product or that needs to be implemented at your organization or at your plant. And there are ways to get them work authorizations basically next business day if needed, by preparing a package and sending them to the border and getting their work permit at the border. So that would be kind of on the short end, obviously. Generally, that's for specialized, higher skilled occupations. That's on the faster end. That's not always the case. I would say the majority of the time, in the immigration context, the individual does have a passport that's from a visa requiring country, such as India or Bangladesh or the Philippines. And these people with these passports, that visa requiring passports, processing time is a lot longer. So you could easily look at, depending on the Canadian Embassy abroad, it could be anywhere from a few months to 5-6+ months, depending on the circumstances. And generally, and I mean this is always generally, but if it's a lower skilled job, then the processing time, and not in demand, then the processing time is going to be a little bit longer to get them here. Next slide, please. So duration, how long do you want this person coming to Canada for? Is this, again, and I touched on this in the previous slide, but are they only coming over for a couple of days? Are they needed here urgently to fix a piece of equipment that's at your plant, or your refinery, and they're needed here immediately, to prevent disruptions, and they have a visa exempt passport? Well, they could be here quite quickly, and that's there are options with regard to getting them here, if those are the instances. There's also 15 to 30 day work permit exemptions for short-term work, for people to be able to come to Canada and actually not need a work permit, as long as they're not staying beyond 15 days within 6 months, or 30 days within 12 months. So there's kind of options to think about there, if they're only coming in for a short-term duration. But if they're coming in for longer term, so if it's someone that you want to hire to fill a skill shortage, you want them to stay indefinitely, permanently, most likely, as long as it all works out, then you might want to look at maybe a pathway that has a permanent residency option, such as the Atlantic Immigration Program or one of the provincial nominee programs. There are also a number of federal programs that have work permit options, but again, it would really depend on the circumstances and what type of job you're offering, and the individual skill set. All of those things play into what kinds of options are available. But duration is one of the things you want to think about when you're kind of assessing, okay, is hiring a foreign worker right for me? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the position, what type of work, what type of occupations are you trying to fill? Are you looking for lower skilled laborers, construction laborers, or fish plant workers, or lower skilled occupations, janitors, that kind of thing? Or are you looking for more technical positions like software developers and engineers? Or are you looking for in-demand occupation, more in-demand healthcare occupations that kind of, maybe it's fall into one of the other, either high skilled or low skilled. So you have nurses and physicians, or also long-term care support workers. Those workers are in demand as well, even though they might not be high skilled. So all of these things are things to consider in terms of what types of options might be available. There are expedited options for people in the tech positions. There's a specific type of program called the Global Talent Stream, where you can expedite both the work permit and both the labor market impact assessment and the work permit process in order to get them here. So there's expedited options for in-demand occupations. And the same thing goes for healthcare occupations that are in demand. And there are, depending on what province you're in, there are different programs that are available that may help you expedite the process. So, these are things that, that are certainly worth considering. All kinds of options out there. It's just a matter of kind of choosing what one's right for you. Not to say that it won't be possible to hire a position that's not in demand. That is certainly possible, especially if you are finding that you're facing difficulties hiring someone with the skills that you need. Generally, if that's the case, then an LMIA is required, which is a labor market impact assessment, which is basically a document that you have to get through the Canadian government, whereby you have to post the ads for 30 days first, and then file an application with the Canadian government requesting this document to permit you to hire the foreign worker. And then the foreign worker will then be able to apply for their work permit with that. So it's really depending on the occupation you have, whether it's in demand, whether it's high skilled, whether it's low skilled, whether it's healthcare, there will be different options available. Okay, next slide. Origin. So where are you recruiting from? And just so we don't have to go back to the last slide, but on the last slide, where I've gotten all of these, these different slides or these different top headers from is, when I meet with a client, these are the things I'm asking them, right, to provide me with the information so that I can do an analysis. So the things that if you're going to hire a foreign worker, or you're thinking about hiring a foreign worker, these are the things that you should be thinking about as well, because they're the things you need to know to determine what options are available. So for example, in the last slide, it said position. So one of the things I asked for would be a job description, so that I can see really clearly, okay, well, what job is this for? Then I can look at the different options that might be available depending on the position being offered. And then that leading into that is, origin. So where is this person from? I always ask for a copy of the person's passport, or at least an indication of what types of nationalities they might hold, and permanent residency for that matter as well. Because depending on the person's country of origin or passport hold, depending on their passport, what passport they hold, and also where they're currently living, that will influence greatly how long it's going to take to get them here. So I mentioned briefly a little bit before, if you're recruiting generally, in the Philippines for your your construction laborers, for example, then you're going to be looking at a longer processing time versus maybe recruiting in another country, because generally the people that are living in the Philippines have Filipino passports. So I'll give you an example. I do work with some construction companies, and whenever I meet with them first, I always say, and I realize this may not be, it may be easier said than done, but Mexico is a visa exempt. It's a visa exempt country. What that means is that if someone holds a Mexican passport, they don't need a visa to come to Canada. They can just get on a plane and come. That's not the case with a country like the Philippines or Bangladesh or those visa exempt countries or visa requiring countries. Sorry. So I'm recommending that they do their recruiting in Mexico if they can. Find their laborers in Mexico, because all we need to do then is obtain the LMIA. And then they can, all their Mexican workers can apply for the work permits at the border on the way in, which basically cuts processing time in half. Or more. So these are the things that you want to think about, is where they're from. It doesn't mean you shouldn't recruit in the Philippines or other places, just something to consider. Are they needed here urgently? And if so, then certainly something to consider. The other piece is, and I haven't really talked about this yet, but French-speaking countries. So there is a program called the Francophone Mobilité, where it's what we call LMIA exempt. So there's no need to canvass the labor market. So as long as you're hiring someone in a high school position and they speak French fluently as their first language, then there's a way for us to get them a work permit quite quick without having to go through the labor market process and obtain the LMIA first. So these are things to consider as well. Maybe especially if you're in somewhere like New Brunswick where there's a high-speaking French population, and they maybe speak, their job doesn't need to be in French, they just need to be able to speak French. So this is something to consider as well, as maybe you want to recruit in a French-speaking country, or maybe you want to look at French-speaking candidates, because there are facilitative programs available for people who are French-speaking. So where the person's from, what passport they have, and or where they're living or where they're residing will dictate process. And one of the reasons why this is that every Canadian embassy across the world has different processing times. So if you're filing an application if someone has a work permit application filed out of the Philippines, there's a specific processing time for that embassy, versus someone filing a work permit out of Bangladesh or China or wherever else, right? There's different processing times. So these are things to consider. And one of the first things I do is I ask for the passport, I look up how long it's going. I decide whether they're visa exempt or not. If they're visa requiring, I look up how long it's going to take to get the work permit, so that the client is informed as to how long it's realistically going to take to get this person here. If the person's from a visa exempt country, then the Australia, Japan, Canada, US, most European Union countries, these people with these passports, the process time is always going to be less, because they never have to apply for a work permit overseas. They can always apply at the border. I shouldn't say always, almost always can apply at the border. So again, will cut down processing time in half. So it's very valuable to know where the person's from, as it will dictate processing time. Okay, let's move on to destination. Destination. So, where is this position going to be located? Are you an employer and you want the individual to be working in Ontario, or are they going to be working in Atlantic Canada, Halifax, or New Brunswick? Where is this job going to be? Because where the job is going to be will dictate, again, what options are available, and how long the process might take to get them a work permit or permanent residency. So there are federal programs that are federal in nature, and what that means is that they cover the whole the whole country. So no matter whether they're going to be working in Ontario or St. John's, Newfoundland, it doesn't matter. If it's a federal program, then the criteria is the same. But there are also regional programs, like the Atlantic Immigration Program, that's regional for Atlantic Canada. And then there are also specific provincial nominee programs that are specific to every different province and territory, that have been set up by their respective provinces or territories, which reflect, and the streams within those programs, so the different streams available, are reflective of the unique needs of the different provinces and territories. So there are lots of nuances between the various different streams across all the different provinces and territories, but the location of work where the person's going to be, that will decide what options are available, at least in terms of getting their permanent residency, and also maybe a work permit, depending on what way we decide to get them their work permit. So it's just something something to be a little bit aware of. One thing I will say about that is, generally speaking, we do a lot of work for people. I just filed an application to the BC PNP a couple days ago, and we do a lot of work with clients in Ontario and Alberta as well. And I will tell you that Atlantic Canada, and I imagine that many of you or most of you are probably in Atlantic Canada, and Atlantic Canada has, I would say, I don't want to say easier programs, but they're, put it this way, if the person has a full-time job in Atlantic Canada, and the employer, has been established in Atlantic Canada for at least 2 years, then generally speaking, of course, as long as they meet the eligibility criteria, which most of the time they do, getting permanent residency is, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but like almost certain, right? So you have a job, you meet the eligibility criteria, you should get your permanent residency in Canada because you have a job offer. And that's the case in Atlantic Canada, which is excellent, right? Because we have programs and they have caps, but we hardly ever actually reach the caps. We always try to and strive to, but here in Atlantic Canada, but we're always in need of more immigrants and more people. And so it's in that sense, it's easier to get your permanent residency if you have a job in Atlantic Canada. Whereas, for example, in Ontario and BC, the programs, their streams, particularly their provincial streams, they have caps and they get full much faster. Well, they get full, right? Here in Atlantic Canada, they don't. So frequently we'll see clients who have a full-time permanent job offer, they're young, they have good English. I mean, everything points like, why can't this person get their permanent residency? And they have to wait. They have to wait until the province decides to invite them based on their skill set or their job, their what they call the knock code, so their occupation. So they can be stuck a little bit. I mean, usually if they're they're on the border like of getting invited, like they will get one eventually, but it's not, oh, I can just apply and get started right away. It's different. And the same thing with British Columbia, it's more of a competitive process. So in BC, there's a points assessment process where you have to like reach a certain amount of points in order for you to be eligible under their program and receive an invite. And I've got clients who maybe their English isn't great, who are kind of stuck, right? Like their English is good enough to work, but it's not high enough to get them an invite to get under that program. Whereas in Atlantic Canada, you just need to have an English test with a CLB 4 or 5, depending on your occupation. So it's in that sense, it can be easier to immigrate to Atlantic Canada. So we have these options. We have these great programs, and we're using them, but we need more immigrants to fill them. On provinces like Ontario and BC, they don't have that issue as much. So yeah, so I thought that was interesting, and I thought I would share that. So let's move along to domestic advertising. Okay, so you're already posting your jobs domestically. So this is another question I'll ask clients, once they decide they want to hire foreign workers, are you already posting these jobs already, if you have a skills gap? There are instances where job posting is not required. There are exemptions to the LMIA process, the Labor Market Impact Assessment process. So it's not always required, but a general default is to assume that it is required. Because in many instances it is, especially for the lower skilled jobs. And so one of the first questions I always ask is, are you posting your jobs already, internally and externally? So if you're posting your jobs internally, I mean, internally there may be some, if you're posting your jobs internally, there may be opportunity for you to maybe transfer someone from another country via intra-company transferee. That's sometimes an option. To get someone internally within your organization to move to Canada. But if you have to post them, the other option, of course, if you don't do that, is to post it outside the organization, post domestically and nationally to try to find somebody. And if you're doing this, it's really important that you include certain things in the ads. If you are going to go through the LMIA process, they have a really strict criteria in terms of what needs to go into these ads and where they need to be posted. And so some of the things that employers will trip up on is that they'll say, oh yeah, I have my ads posted, and I'll look at them and say, well, if they don't meet the criteria, we've got to start over. And then because you have to have the ads posted for 30 days, we have to start the 30-day clock over. So again, it influences timing, things like that. So if you think you might be interested in hiring foreign workers, it would be a good idea to have a chat with us so that we can say, listen, this is, you do need the LMIA, and yes, you do need to post, and these are things you need to do to make sure that the posting, we're not delayed, right? So that the posting is done correctly for the LMIA process. Okay, let's move on to the next piece, involvement. Okay, so how much are you willing to be involved with the foreign worker and their family and their settlement and that kind of thing? And we do work here at our immigration practice group. We do immigration work for all kinds of different size companies, everything from nan and pop shops to medium-sized businesses to large multinationals, and everything in between. And so I've seen clients, employer clients who who are relatively medium-sized companies, basically be not, I want to say so desperate for workers, but be so interested in getting foreign workers here to fill their labor shortage that they will do anything and everything they can to be involved in the process to help make to help attract people here, which could include housing them once they get here, providing them with supports once they get here, paying legal fees for their permanent residency and their work permits, whatever the case may be, But I've also seen situations where employers want to have a completely step back approach and be involved as little as possible. And either are okay, right? There's no requirement that you're completely involved. It really is an individual choice on the employer's behalf. Now, there are certain things the employer has to do, like the employer has to do the advertising and has to pay the processing fees for the LMIA and things like that. But when it comes to actually being involved into the settlement and that kind of thing, of the foreign worker and their families once they get here, there's no actual requirement unless you're filing under the Atlantic Immigration Program. During that program, if you are to use that program, then it's what we call an employer-driven program. So the employer is required to do certain things like initiate a settlement plan and provide certain supports for the foreign worker and their family. I mean, it's not overly laborious or anything like that, but some HR organizations are well apt and are well able to do this, and then others just don't have the capacity to be able to do so. So these are things that you need to consider when you're determining what options you're going to be bringing people under, and what you or what types of options are available for you in your organization if you're going to be hiring foreign workers. I will say that for the employers who have a large HR component and are really keen and really interested, the AIP is an excellent option. But for employers who maybe want to take more of a step back approach and be involved as little as possible, then the AIP is not the best option in those instances. And I will generally recommend, I mean, there are various other programs, but generally in terms of another provincial program, I might recommend the provincial nominee program instead. So there's all kinds of things to consider with that regard. And we can move to the next slide. So yeah, so the next piece is the administrative resources, and this kind of just carries forward from the previous slide as well. What is your administrative bench strength in the sense that how not just how involved do you want to be in their settlement, but the paperwork, and also I don't want to scare you away, but there is a compliance regime when it comes to hiring foreign workers that every employer needs to be aware of, and as long as you do things right, there should never be any issues. But when you hire a foreign worker, you commit to paying them a certain wage. You commit to giving them benefits if you say you're going to. You commit to certain things that you're going to be putting in your application. And about 1/4 of employers get audited under the various different streams. And so if you deviate from that, even knowingly or unknowingly, then there are consequences. And so it's really important that you are, if you're going to be hiring foreign workers, especially multiple foreign workers, you need to have someone who is at least, organized and, able to be able to keep the documents. You have to keep all records for 6 years minimum. In terms of audits, who's able to be part of the audit compliance inspection process, and be able and willing to do that, so that and keep organized, right? So again, even the smaller organizations can do this. They just have to be aware that they have to do it, because it is a really important component whenever you're hiring a foreign worker. There are random audits, and like I said, about 1/4 of employers are audited. There are also targeted audits, but most of them are random audits, and most of the time it's fine as long as you don't deviate from what you promised the foreign worker in the original application. Okay, we can move on to the next one. Yeah, we're only a couple of slides left. Okay, so target, how many people are you recruiting? So, you know, are you in a situation where you have a large construction project and you need 50 construction workers? Or are you in a situation where you're a small niche IT company and you need like one software engineer or software developer or whatever the case may be? I mean, these are obviously completely entirely different situations, which would require, you know, different things to consider, but and different, you know, pathways for getting these people here. But there's certainly some things to consider, because the more you're going to bring, the more people you want to bring in, well, the heavier your administrative bench needs to be, because now you have 50 people for which you've got to keep 50 files and keep the records for 6 years, right? So that's something to consider. And also, if you're going to be filing if it's a case of a construction company, for example, and you want to hire 50 people, processing fees through the LMIA process are going to be really, really heavy. So there's that $1,000 processing fee per applicant per foreign worker, I should say, for under the LMIA. So that would be $50,000 in processing fees alone. So in a situation like that, because it's expensive, you know, depending on the urgency of the situation, you know, maybe they're willing to do that, and they want to pay that money, and you know, because that's the fastest way to get these people here. But if there's not as much of an urgency and they need them for maybe the next season, then maybe the Atlantic Immigration Program or the PNP is a better option, because not only is that a pathway to permanent residency, but it also there's I shouldn't say there's no processing fee, but depending on the province, there's generally smaller or no processing fees, which certainly, at least for the provincial portion, which might be an indicator or a factor in determining what options are available. You know, the other piece is, yeah, I think that's basically mostly all I wanted to say on that. So, you know, overall cost of the program, and timing, you know, it will be, every case is unique and nuanced, but the number of people you want to bring in is going to influence cost almost certainly. And I wouldn't say necessarily influence timeline, because every application is submitted as an individual application. So it's not like you're going to get backlogged by having 50 people submitted. I mean, you know, they're all going to be submitted at the same time, ideally. So there shouldn't be any delays in that sense. But in terms of cost, there certainly might be. But we do, which brings me to next slide, which is financial resources. You know, what's your budget? So, you know, processing fees will increase by the number of people you want to bring in generally. And legal fees obviously would, if you were going to have a lawyer or a consultant do it for you, then you're certainly going to be looking at higher legal fees in that regard. You know, here at McInnes Cooper, if it's a multi application type of scenario, we obviously offer significant discounts for high volume work. But it's something you certainly want to consider, especially when it comes to the processing fees and that LMIA, because that $50,000 for the 50 construction workers is not a small amount of money. So it's something that you want to consider, and certainly think through before you kind of decide to go on that route. Next slide. So we're almost done. It goes about 35 minutes. Yeah, so, you know, our group, you know, we're always available. If you have questions and you're thinking about hiring someone, the best thing to do is to reach out. We'll set up a meeting and we'll strategize for you and your unique situation to determine, you know, what's the best way to bring this person here or these people here. What are the costs in terms of processing fees or legal fees or all of the above. But certainly one thing I've learned, you know, is every situation is like a little puzzle. It's like its own unique circumstances that will warrant its own, you know, strategic, you know, analysis to determine, you know, what's the best way to bring these people or this person here. You can go on to the next slide. So we're done. My slide is done. My slideshow is done anyway. So what I'm going to get you guys to do is, if you haven't already, start typing your questions. I'm happy. We've got 20 minutes or so to answer questions. Put them all in the box, and I'll read as many of them as I can, and do that. The only piece I'll mention is that I have here a slide on legal labs. MC Legal Development Labs. This is an offering that we, McInnes Cooper, can do for your organization. Basically, it's a teaching type of scenario where we can provide a workshop to your organization structured to your individual unique needs or wants. So particularly if it's immigration related, so let's say that you're an organization and you have recent HR turnover and you're really keen to learn about the Atlantic Immigration Program as well as the PNP program and how you might use those to help bring, entice, your either people that are already working for you or bring more people in and then recruit new people. Then we could do like a session on an hour and a half session on those programs and how they work and what's required of you, and document keeping and record keeping and things like that, and give you kind of the full lay of the land. And so that would be something that might be worthwhile for your company so that you can understand how to do that. I hope that everyone found today's webinar useful, and thank you very much for having me.